white with rime before sunrise. Maren came out in her coat and gloves and found the yard hushed under that first thin cold. Smoke rose straight from the cookhouse chimney. The horses breathed clouds into the dim light. At the chopping block by the shed stood the axe Jonah had first handed her, newly hafted, the hickory handle sanded smooth and rubbed with oil until it shone honey brown in the dawn. A folded paper was tucked beneath it. She pulled off one glove and opened the note. It was not a long note. Jonah did not waste words on paper any more than he did in speech. Winterwood don't cut itself. If you mean to stay, I thought you ought to have a proper tool of your own. Jr. She read it twice. Then she turned the handle in her hand and found, near the grip, 3 small letters cut clean by a careful knife. MD. For a long while she simply stood there with the cold biting her face and the handle warm where her hand had closed around it. Ione saw her through the cookhouse window and pretended not to. Life on the ranch did not suddenly become easy because truth had won one hard fight. Fences still broke. Stock still drifted. Winter still came whether men deserved mercy or not. But it became steadier. That was no small thing. The damages Vernon Kells paid kept the bank from circling. Amos Clegg, being a cautious soul even in fairness, set every figure down twice and had Jonah sign for all of it in ink so permanent it seemed to bruise the page. Dace Weller was sent east under guard to stand trial in the county seat for arson, fraud, and the rest of what could be proved besides. Folks in Juniper Crossing discussed whether his punishment would satisfy them. Maren found she did not much care. The valley would never trust him again, and a man who had built his life on other people's trust would feel that loss to the bone. The new line cabin went up before the first real snow. Not large, not fancy, just square, sound, and honest, with a proper stone footing and a stout shutter on the west side. Thad insisted on helping notch the boards though his hands blistered under the work. Jonah led him, which was its own kind of apology and permission. One afternoon, while the roof still waited for its last course of shingles, Thad stood beside Maren holding nails in his mouth and said around them, "Uncle Jonah smiles more when you're in the yard." "Careful," she said. "You'll swallow one of those." He spat the nails into his palm, unrepentant. "It's true. He smiles more when the hay gets in dry too. That doesn't mean he ought to marry a haystack." Thad thought about that. "No, but you'd be easier to talk to." Maren laughed in spite of herself, and the sound carried farther than she meant it to. Jonah looked down from the ladder where he was setting shingles and glanced between them, suspicious on principle. "Nothing," Maren called up. "That word," he said, "has caused more trouble than most others I know." By November the valley had settled the story into the shape it meant to keep. Juniper Crossing could do that with any event, sanding down sharp corners until what remained fit neatly between church on Sunday and gossip by Tuesday. Yet some edges refused sanding. When Maren walked into the mercantile, men made room at the stove. When she named a price for mending harness or hauling freight to the upper meadow, nobody thought to bargain on the grounds that she was a woman. A few still disapproved, no doubt. People were free to be fools in private. But public contempt had gone out of fashion where she was concerned, and that too was a kind of justice. The first snow came in earnest on a Sunday evening, thick and slanting, hushing the whole ranch under white. Ione made stew. Hob read aloud from an old newspaper until Clem told him he mangled names beyond recognition. Thad fell asleep in the chair by the stove with a history book open on his chest. Jonah rose to carry him to bed, then stopped when he saw Maren already bending to lift the book free without waking the boy. Their hands brushed in the firelight. It was the smallest thing. Still, neither of them moved for a moment. Jonah looked tired in that warm, flickering light, but not hollow the way he had looked in summer. Grief still lived in him. It likely always would. Yet it no longer sat at the head of his table telling the living where to place their plates. "You ought to have a place in the house," he said quietly. Maren straightened. "I have one. You have a room that leaks less than it used to." "I've known worse roofs." "That isn't the same thing." No, it wasn't. She set the book aside and lowered her voice so as not to wake Thad. "Jonah, if you're offering charity, save it. If you're offering convenience, I can judge my own." His expression changed. Not wounded exactly. More like a man deciding whether to risk the truth without having time to prepare it. "I'm offering neither," he said. From the stove, Ione made a great clatter with the ladle that fooled no one. Maren could feel the room holding still around them. Jonah glanced once toward the sleeping boy, once toward the storm at the window, then back to her. "I am trying," he said, each word deliberate, "to tell you that this place has come to feel more like itself with you in it, and I have too. I do not know any graceful path to that sentence. It is the best I can do." Maren had been wanted before, in ways that made her wary. Needed, in ways that made her weary. But this was neither hunger nor convenience. This was a man laying down truth like a tool on a table and stepping back from it. She looked at him a long moment. Then she said, "For a man with no graceful path, you arrived well enough." Something eased in his face then, something old and guarded and stubbornly hopeful. Ione, without turning around, said, "If the two of you are finished circling the same gatepost, supper's getting cold." They did not marry that winter. Life was not so tidy as that, and neither of them was built for rushing holy things because a valley expected a ceremony to follow a glance. But by Christmas, Maren had moved her few belongings into the spare room at the house. By New Year's, she and Jonah had fallen into the kind of partnership that people noticed first in chores long before they noticed it in touch. He split kindling before she asked. She mended his coat elbows before he admitted they were gone through. He listened when she spoke about feed tallies, and she listened when he spoke about creek levels and spring runoff. Thad, who had the least patience of any of them, informed Ione one morning over mush that they are taking too long on purpose. "Probably," Ione said, buttering toast. "Past the molasses." When spring returned to the Bitterroot, it returned all at once, with snow water in the ditches and blackbirds in the reeds, and mud greedy enough to keep a boot if a person stepped wrong. The first calves hit the ground strong. The hay meadows greened. The new line cabin stood weather-tight on the rise, its chimney drawing true. In May, Jonah drove into Juniper Crossing with Maren seated beside him, not as hired help now, nor as some curiosity to be explained, but as the woman who kept the books on half the ranch business and most of the common sense. They stopped at the bank. Amos Clegg had new spectacles and the same old caution. "I have the revised deed prepared," he said, sliding a paper across the desk. "As requested." Maren frowned at Jonah. "What revised deed?" He looked almost embarrassed, which on him was close to astonishing. "The north pasture and the creek allotment. I've been meaning to settle it proper." She stared at the page. Her name was there, not as a servant, not as a dependent, as a legal share in the land she had helped save. "Jonah, I told you once you ought to keep your own tally," he said. "This is mine." She lifted her eyes to his. "This is too much." "No," he said. "It's less than the truth, but the law prefers smaller handwriting." Amos Clegg coughed into his fist. Whether from sentiment or dust it was hard to say. Maren signed. The town heard before they reached the mercantile steps. It always did. By the time they came out again, Mrs. Henley from the dressmakers had crossed the street under pretense of admiring a bolt of calico in the window and offered Maren the first real smile she had ever given her. "Seems you'll be staying on," the woman said. Maren tucked the folded deed into her satchel. "Seems I will. Now and then, if a story has kept you company this far, it may be because you know the feel of earning your place twice, once in labor and once in the eyes of people slow to see it. If so, you were not alone in that. Plenty of good hearts have had to stand their ground before they were ever offered a chair by the fire." The wedding, when it came in late June, was held in the yard under the cottonwoods and looked more like a gathering than an event somebody had arranged to impress the county. Ione baked pies enough for 3 tables. Hob wore a collar so stiff he moved his whole torso to look left. Clem shaved his beard into some regrettable shape and bore the teasing with dignity. Sheriff Blevins attended because he happened to be passing through, which nobody believed for a second. Amos Clegg came too, standing carefully at the edge of things as if celebration might cost interest. Thad stood up with Jonah in a jacket he had outgrown at the wrists, solemn as a deacon and prouder than anybody there. Maren wore a plain cream dress Ione had altered from fine fabric bought in town, and the same work-strong hands that had first taken an axe in front of a laughing yard. Jonah looked at her the way men look at mountain weather when it breaks clear after days of storm, not because they own it, but because they are grateful to stand in it. There were no grand speeches. The preacher said what was needed. The wind moved softly in the cottonwoods. A meadowlark called from the fence. When it was done, Thad stepped forward with something wrapped in cloth. Maren opened it and found the old axe head clean bright, and set on a polished new handle, lighter than the work axe, balanced for keeping rather than chopping. Near the grip, beside her initials, Thad had burned another mark in careful letters. Home. Maren looked at him, and the boy who was not so much a boy anymore ducked his head as if embarrassed by his own tenderness. It seemed fitting, he muttered. She kissed his soot-marked forehead in front of everybody and made him suffer it. Years later, folks still told the story wrong in little ways. Some said Jonah had tested her out of arrogance. Some said he had known at once what she was made of. Some claimed the whole valley fell silent from admiration, which was giving too much poetry to a place mostly fond of noise. But the true part lasted, as true parts tend to do. A woman once stood in a ranch yard and said she could work harder than any man there. A rancher brought her an axe. By the end of it, she had cut more than wood. She had cut a path into a life nobody else meant to hand her. And on certain evenings, when the light went gold across the meadow and the shadows lengthened toward the porch, a woman with steady hands could still be seen setting that axe by the chopping block while a tall man came down the steps to take the wood basket from her without being asked, and a nearly grown boy called from the yard that supper was getting cold. If that scene would have held you a little longer by the fire, then that was reason enough to tell it. And if you've got a place in the world you fought to keep or build, you'd have fit in well at the Rusk table. The last thing the dusk took each evening was the pale gleam of that axe handle by the porch rail, smooth from use, waiting for morning.